The small country making Putin squirm.
The final results are yet to be presented by electoral authority, but it's clear for now that PAS is set to get at least 54 out of 101 seats in the parliament. After Russian invasion of Ukraine, people really saw the support of the free world. European Union, United Kingdom, US were close to Moldova in these past 3.5 years with support, with helping Moldova go through a major economic challenges caused by the Russian aggression of Ukraine. Because we saw a dramatic inflation spike, we saw the increase in energy prices here, we saw a massive Russian hybrid warfare against Moldova. And Moldovans really felt the support of the European Union, of the free world, as I was saying, and I believe that played a crucial role.
Adrian Balute, Chief of Staff to President Sandu of Moldova, speaking to BBC News on Monday. Felicity, what's the story?
The story is that the country's ruling pro-EU party won a comfortable majority in elections on Sunday. It beat the opposition, which was comprised of several pro-Russian parties, by quite a considerable margin. And that's come as a bit of a surprise because there was quite a lot of fears that it was going to be a lot closer than that. It was a real sort of neck and neck in the lead up. Around 1.6 million people cast their votes, which was about just over half of eligible voters, and that's a higher turnout than in previous elections. And it's a big deal. Moldova is a small, poor country that is sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. It used to be part of the Soviet Union, and it was seen very much as a territory that Putin was interested in. Well, you know what Putin's like. He obviously would love to bring it back into the Russian fold and, have his Russian empire and all over again. So it's quite a big deal that Moldova has decided to go the other way.
Yeah. So specifically then, how does this result in the Moldovan election compare against previous years? What sort of swing are we seeing?
So the winning party, they're called the Party of Action and Solidarity, led by the Moldovan president, Maya Sandu, and they won just over half a percentage of the vote, and that's translated into 55 out of 101 seats in parliament, so a comfortable majority.
Harriet.
I think the important context here, though, is that she actually in last year's presidential election, she actually failed to secure a majority in the first round of voting, which was hugely embarrassing for her because she had expected to comfortably win a second term in this presidential election over her pro-Kremlin Socialist Party rival last year. And then she had to go into this incredibly embarrassing second round of voting, largely because she had expected to comfortably win, but then she lost the majority, and this was blamed on an unprecedented assault on the democratic process by foreign forces, which she claimed were pro-Russian criminal groups. So I think, yes, we can look at this as a kind of pro-Western, anti-Kremlin victory in Moldova, but I think it's important to look at what happened last year and the context for this, which was, not so comfortable.
Yeah, and also the process of actually joining the EU, Arion, which is, what her party has stated they would like to do. I mean, it's part of their constitution anyway, isn't it? They voted on it already, I think, but this is another mandate for that. That is a not unbureaucratic process that takes some time. It's not sped up by this vote, is it really?
No, not particularly. And, formally, Moldova has advanced incredibly quickly through the process. It had candidate status from 2023. Accession negotiations opened in June last year. And then you've got this ongoing screening and this total, chapter by chapter work throughout the years since then. So you've kind of got this enormous attempt to push them into the process, but it's not going to happen incredibly quickly because there's this thing called the acquis communautaire, which is the EU's whole rule book on law and judiciary reform and anti-corruption and public procurement and competition rules and all of these things. And you have to meet all of these standards before you're going to be included in the running for, actually joining the EU. So, we're a long way from that. And the fact that Russia has has tried to influence the process suggests that they're not going to just stop at that. You know, they really did throw the entire electoral disruption handbook of intimidation and cyberbullying and all of the different approaches that they have at their fingertips at this. And you get the sense that that's not going to be the end of the story for the Kremlin.
Yeah, you were nodding, Harriet. What have we seen the Russians try and do?
Well, like Arion was saying, I mean, pretty much everything. So the allegations range from just kind of interference in terms of money, influence, and then towards cyber attacks, bomb threats at polling stations, both in Moldova and in other countries as well, like Italy. So the police are talking about this as an unprecedented effort by Russia.
Why would they be threatening Italy? Can people from Moldova vote in an Italian polling booth?
Yeah, so that's what's really interesting about it, actually, that Moldova has this incredibly powerful diaspora that typically votes in favor of this pro-European Action and Solidarity Party, and that are, generally speaking, younger and more inclined to a pro-Western sentiment. So that's the Sandu's stronghold is in the Moldovan diaspora. So that's partly in Italy.
Okay, and what was the reaction, Felicity, of the pro-Russian parties in Moldova to this election result?
It was quite predictable, really. The leader of the pro-Russian Patriotic Electoral Bloc, they immediately declared victory even when the votes hadn't finished counting, and then after that urged protests on the street. And there were protests, although I don't think they were that huge. But they have also complained that they were kind of mistreated throughout the process. So 2 parties within the pro-Russian bloc were banned from participating on the eve of the election due to concerns about illegal funding. It's quite interesting because the country is actually quite a divided country in many ways. So, you know, on this election, it was like pretty 50-50. There's still a lot of support for Russia within the country. And there is an area called Transnistria, which is lies along the border with Ukraine, that is a breakaway state where about 1,500 Russian troops are still present. And the government of that breakaway territory has frequently requested Russian annexation several times. So this is a victory, but there is still a lot of support for Russia within the territory, and, you know, complaints that actually the pro-Russian bloc were not very well treated. And also voters in Transnistria complained that they faced logistical challenges. They had to travel to polling stations a long way away in order to vote. So kind of predictable. And also that's how, you know, the Kremlin has also come out and said it wasn't fair.
I mean, you're saying predictable, but do you think that the pro-Russian voices across Moldova are just peddling Kremlin propaganda when they say their vote was suppressed? Or do you detect that some of that is actually going on as well? I mean, both things can be happening, can't it? The Russians can be trying to meddle in the elections, but also pro-Russian voices can be suppressed.
Of course. I think there was probably a bit of both. I think it's a complicated picture. I think it's without doubt that Russia's efforts to kind of to sow the seeds of, you know, misinformation is, you know, there's definitely evidence for that, and it was very sophisticated. There was this widespread voter buying operation. Voters were bribed to vote for particular parties. Cyber attacks. They were quite big on TikTok, sort of saying that President Sandu had a drugs problem, making up all these, you know, lies about her. But, you know, there is also genuine Russian sentiment, as there is in other countries like Estonia. I'm sure that goes back to, you know, the history and the geography of the region and being part of the Soviet Union. These things are always so much more complicated. I think there is probably a bias in the West that we want to make it look much more simpler than it really is.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more about Transnistria, because it is such a fascinating thing. Not that we talk about Moldova much, but this sliver of land in Moldova. It's fascinating because, Arion, when you look at a map, you know, from a Western perspective, from a European perspective, I suppose you can sort of understand why Putin would approach Ukraine from the east. He's on the east. You look at where Transnistria is, and it's on the east of Moldova, but that's on the west of Ukraine. And it's sort of fascinating that there are such strong pro-Russian feelings there.
Totally. I mean, you think about Transnistria, and it sounds like one of those places that's a fictional setting from a Cold War spy novel or something. But it's real. It's this thin strip of land, as Felicity was saying, that runs along the Dniester River between Moldova and Ukraine. And officially it is part of Moldova, but practically it's been operated as this self-declared republic since 1990, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, Moldova leaned towards independence and closer ties with Romania, but the population of Transnistria, which was heavily Russian-speaking and with this quite large Slavic minority, they resisted, basically fearing dominion from Moldovan and Romanian nationalism. And that led to this brief but violent war that has since been frozen. You know, it's kind of just a tension that has lingered. And part of the reason why, apart from the fact that Moldova is very poor and is still struggling to right itself to meet some of those stringent demands of the EU, that the EU isn't willing to just take them into their fold, is because there's this frozen conflict and they don't want to have to deal with that. So it's sort of quite convenient in the status quo, the sort of relationship that it has right now, neither part of the Russian sphere nor entirely fully embraced by the EU. And I think that's why it's most likely that we're going to see something like the way that it is continuing for some time.
But we've talked about the suppression of pro-Russian sentiment, supposedly the suppression of pro-Russian sentiment in Moldova and Transnistria as well. But what we haven't mentioned is on the flip side, the artificial amplification of pro-Russian sentiment, because a really, really big part of the Kremlin's kind of war on democratic processes in this part of the eastern flank of Europe and eastern flank of NATO, formerly these Soviet countries, a really big part of this is the use of cyber warfare, and like a lot of it fueled by AI now, to flood these places with disinformation. Some of the pro-Russian sentiment isn't in fact rooted in reality, but it's a form of brainwashing effectively. And on top of that, you've also got this massive wave of illicit cash, like Kremlin cash effectively, that's being funneled into these countries, into Moldova, but also Romania, also Slovakia, also Poland. This massive amount of Russian money to promote Russian-leaning opposition parties and Russian-leaning candidates and pro-Kremlin candidates. So this is like a triple warfare. There's all this disinformation, and there's all this dirty money, and there's all this just like threats and attacks and cyber warfare and bomb threats too. So it's very difficult to separate a legitimate pro-Russian leaning with what Russia wants there to be, which is in fact an anti-EU leaning.
Yeah, I guess in terms of implications for all of us, Felicity, in a way it kind of comes down to the question of whether this sort of election result makes it a softer target for Putin, because he'll say, like Ukraine, you know, they're against us, they want to be part of Europe, but look, they have all these Russian-leaning people and Russian speakers and stuff, and so therefore this should be in our sights, or whether it makes it harder because, like the Scandinavian countries, they've stood up to Putin and said, this is the language you understand, go away.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a blow to Putin, I think, this election result, and what he does with it or how it influences his thinking about the region. And I think that's what's so interesting. There was a good piece in The Guardian this week, which was kind of a profile about Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, and sort of saying that he's now reaching out to the West. Obviously, he's been this sort of strongman ally of Russia, but he's now sort of trying to kind of play the game between the West and Russia. And, you know, there's talk of should the West offer him a way out of the Russian shadow. So I think it has implications for all our lives, because obviously these countries are kind of on the front line of the conflict with Russia, and what they do and where their elections take them and what their leaders, you know, whether they sort of lean more towards the Russia or to the West, obviously is a really big deal. And this has huge implications for Ukraine, to have, you know, Russian troops and Russian influence, a hostile neighbour, another hostile neighbour would have been a big deal for them. So I think they're breathing a sigh of relief.